Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. The belief in angels is one of the most widely held aspects of religious faith in human history. This belief likely goes back to prehistoric times, though nobody really knows. There is no question that angels have always been conceived of as supernatural beings who are not subject to the same physical restrictions and emotional upheavals as the likes of us. Almost by definition, they are assumed to be immortal, to be mostly of spiritual composition, and most importantly, to be somehow associated with the divine. Anything beyond this is subject to the beliefs of any given religion. It is interesting to wonder why people ever came up with a belief such as this. Based on what we see today, nobody has ever actually seen an angel. It is possible that people may have thought they spotted one somewhere, but it's a good bet that if somebody else was there looking at the same thing, they would not necessarily have labeled it an angel. This problem is not quite the same as the argument for not believing in God. With the case of God, people needed some plausible explanation for how the world came into being and what the purpose of life and existence are. Angels are not needed for either of those. So who drummed up the idea that they exist to begin with? It is likely that our primary belief in angels stems from the Bible. While this is debatable for non-monotheistic religions such as Hindu or Buddhism, when it comes to the monotheism, it all traces back to the Bible. Angels are mentioned many times in the Bible, including several times in the Torah. There is little doubt that the belief in angels was strong in biblical times. The fact is that it never really diminished in the 2,500 or so years since the close of the Bible. If anything, the belief grew stronger, as there were many more avenues to detect their presence and to conceive of their reality. Angels have been imagined in every imaginable scenario, from salvation to destruction to bringing good news to winning ball games. There are good angels and there are evil angels, and probably an assortment of in-between angels. They fill the role of bringing a godly presence into the world when God is not easy to find. But the question arises, what really are they? Are they individual beings, as many would suppose? Are they real in the sense that we are real? Or is it more in the sense that numbers or thoughts are real? Products of the human mind that attain a level of reality when we believe them to be real. In the many times that they appear in the Bible, it is difficult to dismiss the idea that they have a physical presence. People see them and interact with them. They speak and they act and do whatever it is that God demands of them. But at the same time, it is sometimes difficult to determine if this angelic presence that is described wouldn't look any different from a person if those witnessing them did not have their angel detecting glasses on. The Hebrew word the Bible almost invariably uses for angel is malach. That word means two things, angel and messenger. While it is true that there is another word for messenger, the word malach also serves this purpose frequently. What is the connection between an angel and a messenger? This question is not hard to answer. An angel, of course, is a messenger of God. It would not be inaccurate to translate the somewhat common biblical phrase, angel of God, as messenger of God. This, probably better than any other description, is the defining feature of the biblical notion of angels. They are messengers of God. This week's parsha is called Vayeira. That word means, and he appeared. It introduces an absolutely astounding verse in the Bible that comes across as something as routine as the breeze blowing through the air. The opening verse reads, Hashem appeared to Abraham in the grove of Mamre as he sits at the opening of his tent in the heat of the day. The Bible springs these sorts of verses at us out of nowhere, like we should be expecting them. We read it so innocently that we miss the astounding impact of what just happened. This man, Abraham, is apparently sitting at the opening of his tent, perhaps trying to catch an errant breeze on a hot day, and God appears to him. Why don't things like this happen to you or me? Even more amazing than this is the fact that the text doesn't state what God did or said to Abraham. In fact, the next dozen verses don't mention God at all. they go into a completely different story that seems to have nothing whatsoever to do with God appearing to Abraham out of nowhere. This story is very routine, but nevertheless a rather mysterious encounter with three strangers who are somehow standing right next to Abraham as if they were conjured out of thin air. He simply lifts his eyes and there they are. He then goes about the business of offering them a meal and a place to rest. There are a few verses that describe the elaborate preparations he went about to make this meal. Finally, they sit down to eat. What has to be remembered is that the verse preceding all of this told of Hashem appearing to Abraham. Where was Hashem when all this preparation was going on? Did Abraham simply put Hashem on hold? The text does not even hint at an answer to this question. It seems that the question itself is improper, as if all of this should have been expected and par for the course. But suddenly, in the middle of the meal, one of the men asks him where his wife Sarah is. It isn't clear how this man knew Sarah's name or even that Abraham had a wife. Abraham, not missing a beat, tells him that she is in the tent. Next comes the clincher to this whole strange encounter. The man announces that he will return at this time of life, presumably meaning this time next year, and Sarah, the wife of Abraham, will have born a son. The text then describes that Sarah and Abraham were both old and that the way of women had ceased from Sarah, making this wild prediction highly unlikely. Sarah, upon hearing this incredible news, then laughed to herself, privately voicing her incredulity over the obvious fact that they were long past childbearing age. Hashem finally re-enters the story at this point and asks Abraham why Sarah laughed over the impossibility of her having a baby in her old age. Hashem asks Abraham, quote, "Is anything too wondrous for Hashem?" and reiterates that she will indeed bear a son at this time of life. It should be noted that there is a little backdrop to this story. Right before this in the Torah, in last week's Parsha, Abraham was instructed by God with the commandment of circumcision. This commandment takes up an entire chapter of the Torah, and it became the defining feature of both biblical and post-biblical Judaism. It is difficult to overstate the significance of circumcision in enabling the Jews to stick with their religion through thick and thin. But in that chapter, something else happens. Both Abraham and Sarah receive new names from God. Abraham's name was changed from his birth name of Avram, while Sarah's name was changed from her birth name of Sarai. In addition to that, Abraham was told by God that Sarah would be blessed and would bear a son who would be the ancestor of an illustrious line. Abraham's reaction to this astounding news was strikingly similar to that of Sarah in this week's Parsha. He fell on his face and laughed. He even expressed the same sentiments that Sarah would later do, questioning whether a man his age and a woman her age could possibly have a child. He followed this by saying that he would be satisfied if Yishmael, his son through Sarah's former slave girl Hagar, would live and presumably be his heir. God's response to this is that Sarah will indeed bear a son, and his name will be Yitzhak, a word derived from the Hebrew word for laughter, which was used to describe both Abraham's and Sarah's reactions to this amazing news. So with this background material, we know that Abraham had already heard that Sarah would bear a son. That brings up the question of why these three men showed up at all in Abraham's life, if the main news that they brought was already known to Abraham. It is possible that the purpose of their visit was to announce this to Sarah, but this is somewhat unlikely since they really told it to Abraham. Of course, there is another question of why Abraham himself had not already told Sarah, but it is possible that this was an issue of timing. Then there is a further question of why God asked about Sarah's laughter in a somewhat accusative manner, but did no such thing to Abraham when he voiced an almost identical doubt expressed also through laughter. Furthermore, when Hashem questioned Sarah's laughter, it was Abraham who was asked and not Sarah. Why didn't Hashem ask Sarah about it directly? There may be a way of explaining this entire little story and answering all of the questions. Where did Hashem vanish to when these men arrived? The answer is that Hashem didn't vanish. Hashem was there in the presence of these men who arrived out of nowhere. This was how Hashem appeared to Abraham. They were regular men who were likely unaware of the divine nature of their sudden appearance, but they served the function of messengers of God. In other words, they were angels, but with the physical reality of real men. Their message was to repeat to Abraham what he had already heard from God. When Sarah heard this and laughed in disbelief, Hashem asked Abraham why she did this. Why didn't Hashem ask Sarah this question? The answer is because Abraham himself still had the same doubts that he expressed when he first heard the news. They both laughed. Hashem asked Abraham about Sarah's laughter because it was the perfect way to convey the message to him that this news would indeed come to be. Nothing was beyond Hashem's ability, even a couple bearing a child in their old age. Hashem, thus, was really asking Abraham about his own laughter and disbelief, but doing so through the laughter of Sarah. There was no better way of getting Abraham to hear the message than by forcing him to confront Sarah's own identical disbelief and laughter. This all came about through these three men who were serving in the perhaps unwitting roles of angels of Hashem. They were there to bring about the acceptance of this news. They were, in a sense, the appearance of Hashem to Abraham. They were normal people, but they were also messengers of God. This is the Torah's view of life. Things happen. People show up at your door. They say things. They ask questions. They go away and life goes back to normal. But they were in some way messengers of God, angels conveying some perhaps hidden message to those to whom that message must be conveyed. It could be something revelatory, or it could be something that we already know but have not quite been able to accept. Everyday people or events could be God's way of telling us what we truly need to know. These are God's angels. Shabbat Shalom.